We're all familiar with the story of Cinderella, the tale of the underdog who, through perseverance, fortune, or karmic justice, eventually achieves success. It's a story as old as time itself, and one we've seen repeated many times in the automotive industry. The latest retelling of that story involves Hyundai, who, through the development of the plucky i30N sports hatchback, has begun a transformation from a brand people usually buy with their heads to one people might now consider buying with their hearts. This is the i30 Fastback N, the second European model in Hyundai's N range. Essentially, it's a tweaked version of the standard 5-door hatchback which we've seen before. All the ingredients are very similar, but instead of that familiar hatchback, we now get a swooping fastback design. Essentially, it's a 4-door coupe, which is something we haven't really seen before in this segment. It has the soul of an i30N, and if you're familiar with that car, then you'll know that that means it commands respect. The N range was born in Namyang but honed at the Nürburgring, conceived in South Korea but forged in the fires of the Green Hell. Right, that's a bit dramatic, but what I'm trying to say is it's a serious car. In the space of a few short years, Hyundai has emerged from performance obscurity to becoming runners-up in World Rally Championship and winning the World Touring Car Championships in 2018. It's now an irrefutable fact that anything with an N badge has performance in spades. These road cars really do a passable imitation of Hyundai's racing cars. Okay, they're not quite as focused, they can't do everything that a racing car can, but one thing they can do is put a massive smile on your face. Power comes from a 2-litre turbocharged engine that bangs out 272 brake horsepower. So it's not quite at the top of the hot hatch food chain, but 272 is plenty for a front-wheel drive hatch. 0 to 60 takes 6.1 seconds with the performance pack, which is the only model we'll get in the UK, and it feels every bit as quick as the numbers might suggest. When Hyundai first launched the i30N, nobody really knew what to expect. We thought we'd get a car that was quite capable, but one that would ultimately fall short of the models that it was trying to compete with. Sure, people would buy it, but mostly because of the price and the warranty. What we actually got was a car that wasn't just there to make up the numbers. It was a car that was there to compete, and not just on value, but on merit. And within 5 minutes of driving the fastback version, I could tell, yeah, they're on to another winner. The big question is, why a fastback? The status quo for companies making this type of car is very much to make a debut with a hot hatchback and to evolve along a more pragmatic path with an estate. But Hyundai has forsaken pragmatism for passion. If the i30N is a working class hero, the i30 Fastback N is Hyundai's attempt to go further upmarket. It still has the same sporty cues as the hatchback, including the red accent line front and rear, but now incorporates a swooping roofline tapering towards a cheeky bootlid spoiler. It feels more grown up. Gone is the boy racerish blue. In its place, we now get a more sophisticated shadow grey. Under the surface, there are slight changes too. The rear axle wheel geometry, anti-roll bar bushing and bump stop stiffness have been softened, as has the vertical and lateral stiffness of the front suspension, making it a slightly less aggressive setup on paper. Whether you like it or not is all subjective, of course, but I happen to think it's a cracking little package and one that's actually more appealing than the i30N hatchback, which I felt didn't quite push the boundaries far enough. Whether you like it or not is kind of irrelevant, but one thing is for sure, the people that buy the fastback will be buying it because they specifically like the looks. It's all very well looking the part, but a car like this also has to perform. No amount of good looks will be enough to guarantee this car's success, so the N brand's dynamic capabilities must be thoroughly scrutinized. So the first thing that strikes you is how much torque there is with this car. Hyundai reckons it's 353 Newton meters, and I reckon that is actually quite conservative. On the overboost, they give you 373 Newton meters, and that lasts about 25 seconds. Interestingly, it develops all of that torque from as low down as 1500 RPM. So you got access to every single bit of that grunt, from barely above tick over. The steering is very direct. It's a car that wants to tuck its nose into a corner, and you can get on the power super early. Performance pack cars come with an electronic limited slip differential, and that really helps you maintain a very tight line through the corners. Tyres, Pirelli P0s, they hang on quite gamely. They're not the last word in grip, but what this car lacks in 10/10 dynamic ability, it makes up for in fun. It's worth asking the question how the Fastback compares to the hatch, and the truth is, they're very similar. The difference in weight is so minuscule that you'll barely feel it on the track, and the changes they have made to this car will eventually filter down to the hatchback version. There really isn't that much in it. Whichever one you choose, you'll probably love. The ride was one thing that Hyundai was criticized for with this car when it was first launched, and people said it was a little bit too firm, a little bit too jiggly. I wasn't really concerned with it overly, but what they've done with the Fastback version is to soften it up a little bit, give it a little bit more compliance, especially in the sport mode. And that's really handy when you're out on the road. When you're on track and you want to really push on, you can of course put it in the N mode, which is the most dynamic setting. And in that mode, it is super firm. One thing I'm really pleased with is that Hyundai haven't backed it off too much. The N is a firm car, and they've really run with that. Again, there are faster hot hatches. There are cars with better dynamic ability, especially at 10/10. But can I think of another car that I'd rather be in right now? Not really. The best feature of all, that obnoxious exhaust. It just pops and bangs on the overrun like you wouldn't believe. They might be pitching this Fastback model as a more sophisticated car than the hatch, but it's still very much a thug. What we're seeing is that the N brand isn't a fluke. Not only can Hyundai do this, they can do this again and again. You might have noticed that up to this point, I haven't really mentioned the things that Hyundai are best known for, the price or the value, and that's because I don't really need to. That's not why you buy this car. I also haven't mentioned any of this car's rivals, and that's because it pretty much stands alone. I can't think of another four-door hatchback that became a coupe. It's also because I don't need to mention them. This car is good enough to stand on its own merit. It's not just good for a Hyundai, it's not just good value, it's not just good for a first attempt at a performance car, it's just good. With the i30 Fastback N, Hyundai is on its way to completing a genuine Cinderella story. They've created a performance sub-brand that mixes it with the best, and in the i30 Fastback N, they finally have a car you don't necessarily buy with your head. This is a car that for many will be an investment driven by emotion. It's a car you can buy because you genuinely love it. It's a car you can buy with your heart.